Good to have you here. I'm Matthew. In today's episode, a couple gets engaged at the top of Everest and dies the same day. Before they even reached the summit, their lead Sherpa had quit and other climbers were actively avoiding them. The warnings did not slow them down. If anything, they did the opposite. It was May 14th, 2016. Mount Everest's southeast ridge was packed with climbing teams, all chasing the same narrow weather window, one of the shortest the spring season had offered that year. The mountain sits at 29,032 feet, and I want you to hold that number in your head for a minute, because everything that happens in this story takes place in a zone where the air is so thin your body is essentially running on fumes. Weldon Fambro was 41 years old, from Odessa, Texas. He had built a trucking company from the ground up over 15 years entirely on his own. He did not take on investors or partners, and nobody handed him anything along the way, just him, a few trucks, and enough stubbornness to outlast everyone who told him it would not work. And guess what? It did work. By his late 30s, he was running a mid-sized operation across the Southwest, and he was proud of it in the way that people get when they have genuinely earned something difficult. The problem with that kind of pride is that it does not always know when to step back. Weldon had summited Denali in 2012 and Aconcagua in 2014, both guided, both successful. Two serious mountains and real accomplishments. But somewhere between Aconcagua and Everest, the accomplishments stopped being the point. The confidence took over and became the whole story. He booked a premium guided package for the spring 2016 season that included a full Sherpa team, supplemental oxygen, and fixed rope access on the standard South Col route. He had also been carrying an engagement ring since base camp, because Weldon Fambro was not the kind of person who did anything small. Luann Fambro was 37 years old, his girlfriend of 4 years. She owned 3 fitness gyms across West Texas and was in excellent physical shape. She'd done a guided climb of Mount Rainier in 2013 and had trekked to Everest Base Camp in 2015. And she talked about that base camp trip constantly, like it was a credential. Here's the thing about that though. Base camp sits at 17,600 feet. The death zone starts at 26,000 feet. That's nearly 8,500 feet, higher than where Luann had ever been, and those are not the same experience by any measure. She was fit, she was tough, and she had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her above Camp 3. Now, the death zone. I know that sounds dramatic, but the name is accurate, and understanding what it does to a person is the only way to make sense of what comes next. Above 26,000 feet, your body cannot acclimatize. It can only break down. The air up there holds about a third of the oxygen available at sea level, and no amount of fitness or mental toughness changes that math. Experienced climbers know this, and they plan around it carefully. They set hard turnaround times, and they stick to them because the margin for error up there is razor thin, and everyone who has spent real time on high-altitude mountains understands that. What makes hypoxia genuinely dangerous, beyond everything else it does to your body, is that it dismantles your ability to recognize it. Experienced climbers describe it consistently as a kind of quiet confidence that arrives uninvited. You don't feel confused, you feel clear. You feel like the decision you're making is obviously correct, and that anyone questioning it is the one who doesn't understand the situation. The impairment removes the very faculty you would need to detect the impairment. There's actually a clinical name for it. Your brain loses the ability to notice what it's lost. The reason turnaround times exist, the reason fixed ropes exist, the reason experienced guides set hard rules and enforce them regardless of what the client thinks they know is precisely because no one above 26,000 feet can be trusted to accurately assess their own condition. Whatever you are at sea level means nothing up there. The only thing that counts is the call you make in that moment. The spring 2016 season on Everest was heavily trafficked, with multiple teams converging on the same summit window. Forecasters had flagged a deteriorating weather pattern expected to move in by early afternoon on May 14th. Every experienced team on the mountain that day had that information and was building their plan around it. Now here's where things start going wrong, and I want to be clear that this didn't start on summit day. This started the moment Weldon and Luann arrived at base camp. Everest Base Camp is not a glamorous place. It sits on the Khumbu Glacier at 17,600 feet, and it is a sprawling, noisy, crowded collection of tents, gear, and people from all over the world who have spent years preparing for what they're about to attempt. There's a culture to it. Experienced climbers and Sherpas move through it with a quiet seriousness that you pick up on immediately if you are paying attention. People check each other's equipment. They share weather updates. They talk through route conditions with guides who have been up and down this mountain more times than most people can count. It is a place where ego tends to get checked at the door, because everyone there understands that the mountain is the authority and not any individual standing at the bottom of it. The Fambros did not get that memo. From the moment they arrived, Weldon carried himself like someone with nothing left to learn, and Luan was right there with him. Other climbers picked up on it within the first few days. The Sherpa team picked up on it immediately. What I find interesting about Weldon and Luan as a couple is that they weren't the same person underneath the shared attitude. Weldon was the engine of it. He was the one who pushed, argued, dismissed, and led every confrontation. Luan followed his lead in public and backed him up consistently, but there were moments during the expedition, noted by other climbers who were paying attention, where she seemed to hesitate before going along with him, not in any dramatic way. Just small pauses, a look held a second too long, a moment of quiet before she matched his position out loud. Whether that hesitation meant anything or whether she genuinely agreed with him and was just slower to show it, nobody can say. What's clear is that she never pushed back on him in any way that mattered, and every decision he made became their decision by default. The standard acclimatization process on Everest takes weeks, and it is not optional. You go up to Camp 1, you come back down. You go up to Camp 2, you come back down. You push to Camp 3, you come back down again. The whole point is to give your body time to adapt to progressively lower oxygen levels before you commit to the upper mountain. Skipping or compressing that rotation doesn't just make you uncomfortable on the way up. It means you arrive at the higher camps with a body that hasn't adjusted properly. Your oxygen consumption runs higher than it should, and your margin for error on summit day shrinks in ways you won't feel until it's too late. Weldon pushed to compress the rotation from the start, and the Sherpas pushed back. Some of the schedule was maintained, but not all of it. And the time lost in that argument set a tone for everything that followed. Before any of that rotation even begins, though, every team on the South Col route has to pass through the Khumbu Icefall. I want to spend a minute on this because it's a part of the story that matters, and it's easy to skip over. The Khumbu Icefall sits directly above base camp, and it is one of the most objectively dangerous sections of the entire climb. It's a slow-moving river of glacial ice full of deep crevasses and massive ice towers called seracs that can collapse without warning. Climbers cross it on aluminum ladders tied together over gaps that drop a long way down, and the ice shifts constantly as the glacier slowly moves downhill. The standard approach is to move through it efficiently, stay on your guide's line, and stick to the established route. Weldon pushed the pace on the ladders, went around the guide's preferred crossing points twice, and at one point walked ahead of the group onto a crevasse crossing before. The Sherpa had checked whether the snow bridge underneath was stable enough to hold. The Sherpa stopped him and made clear that moving ahead of the group on an unassessed crossing was not acceptable. Weldon kept moving. Luan crossed the same section without comment. It was the first time the Sherpa team understood clearly what kind of expedition this was going to be. From the very first briefings, Weldon's attitude was obvious. He'd paid for this expedition, he'd done 2 big mountains before, and he was not interested in being told what to do. He dismissed safety briefings while they were still happening and treated every piece of guidance from the Sherpa team like it was an inconvenience, rather than information that could keep him alive. Luan was right there with him, and she wasn't just going along with it either. She was vocal about it, openly questioning the Sherpa's judgment in front of other climbers and framing their caution as incompetence. And here's what makes that particularly hard to understand. Luan had been to base camp in 2015. She had spent time around Sherpa guides before, and she had seen firsthand how they operate and what they know. She wasn't coming into this blind to who these people were. She had watched them work, and she still chose to treat their experience like it didn't count for anything. Climbers at base camp form a community, whether they intend to or not. You're sharing the same tents, the same routes, the same fixed ropes, and word travels fast. Word about the Fambros spread quickly, and other teams started keeping their distance early on. I don't mean that in a social sense. I mean they were actively requesting different rope rotations to avoid being tethered near them on the upper mountain. These are people who understand that survival at altitude sometimes depends on the strangers around you, and they were so uncomfortable with the Fambros' behavior that they'd rather reorganize their entire summit logistics than share a rope with them. The first real blow-up with other climbers happened on the Lhotse face. During the rotation push to Camp 3, the Lhotse face is a massive wall of glacial ice sitting at around 23,000 feet, and you ascend it clipped to fixed ropes. There's a protocol to how you move on those ropes. You don't push past people without warning, you don't create slack that could send someone below you swinging, and you don't treat it like a passing lane. Weldon got impatient with the pace of a two-man team ahead of him and started pushing past climbers on the line without any warning. One of those climbers stopped and told him directly that what he was doing was dangerous. Weldon's response was dismissive and loud enough for multiple people on the rope to hear. Luan, just below him on the line, backed him up. The two-man team said nothing else and just noted it. Other climbers on the rope noted it too. By the time everyone reached Camp 3 that evening, the Fambros were the topic of more than one conversation in more than one tent. At Camp 3, sitting at around 24,000 feet, a Sherpa on their team was doing a routine equipment check and found a fitting issue with Luan's oxygen regulator. At that altitude, oxygen equipment is not optional. It is the difference between functioning and not functioning, between making decisions and being unable to make decisions. The fix was straightforward and doable, right there with the tools available. Weldon told the Sherpa to leave it. The Sherpa flagged it again, more directly this time. Weldon dismissed him a second time in front of 3 other climbers from a neighboring tent who were watching the whole exchange. The regulator was never fixed. A trained guide spotted a problem with life support equipment, raised it twice, and was shut down both times by a man whose main qualification was owning a trucking company back in Texas. After that exchange, the lead Sherpa on their team formally requested to be reassigned away from the Fambros. This was a man who had summited Everest 7 times and had been guiding on this mountain for over a decade. A reassignment request mid-expedition is not a small thing. Pulling an experienced guide off a team mid-climb means replacing him with whatever is available, not whatever is best. His request was approved, and a less experienced Sherpa was sent up from a lower camp to take his place. Word of the reassignment moved through the camp community quickly. When a guide with 7 summits requests out, people pay attention, and they did. By the time they reached Camp 4 on the South Col at around 26,000 feet, they were already operating with a compromised oxygen setup and a guide who hadn't been tested at the level this situation was going to demand. It sits on a flat, open plateau where the wind barely ever stops, and teams arrive there already worn down from the climb up through the upper Lhotse face and the Geneva spur. You rest for a few hours in tents that offer minimal protection from the cold, and then you try to sleep before a departure that typically falls somewhere between 9 p.m. and midnight, depending on conditions. Most people don't actually sleep. The altitude makes real rest nearly impossible, and the anticipation of summit day keeps everyone wired. What it actually feels like to lie in a tent at 26,000 feet the night before a summit attempt is something most people can't picture. The cold gets through everything. You're in your sleeping bag fully dressed with your down suit on, and you're still cold. The wind moves across the South Col in a way that makes the tent fabric sound like it's about to give out, and it never fully stops. You keep your oxygen mask on to rest, but real sleep doesn't come. You just lie there in the dark, listening to the mountain, and waiting for the hours to pass, running through everything ahead of you, knowing that in a few hours you're going to ask your body to do something it was never built to do. At an altitude, it was never built to survive. The hours before departure were telling. Weldon was restless and vocal while other teams around them were quiet and focused, conserving energy and going over plans with their guides. The replacement Sherpa attempted to run a proper oxygen equipment check, and Weldon waved him off. Luan's regulator, still carrying the unresolved fitting issue from Camp 3, went into summit night without anyone looking at it. While this was happening, a climber from a neighboring tent raised concerns about the weather window closing faster than expected. The updated forecast was showing the storm arriving earlier than originally predicted, and he was suggesting all teams either push their departure time forward or wait for the next suitable window. It was a reasonable thing to raise. Weldon disagreed, dismissed the concerns, and treated the whole conversation like a personal challenge to his judgment rather than a practical discussion about survival. The other climber eventually stopped engaging and walked away. That team left at 10:15 p.m. within the advised window. The Fambros left at 11:50 p.m., nearly 2 hours late. The stretch between Camp 4 and the balcony covers roughly 1,600 feet of climbing, and it happens almost entirely in the dark. You leave in the middle of the night because you need to reach the summit and get back down before the afternoon weather moves in. And that math only works if you start early enough. The terrain on that section is steep snow and ice, and you are moving in a line with other climbers, headlamps cutting through the dark, oxygen masks on, temperatures sitting well below zero with the wind making it feel worse. It is not technical climbing in the way the Hillary step is technical, but it is relentless and it is slow, and every step costs more than it should. because of where you are. The Fambros were already behind the pace of other teams on that section. The replacement Sherpa was monitoring Luan closely and staying near. Weldon was moving ahead of the groups, more than he should have been, pushing pace in a situation where pace is not the variable that matters. They reached the balcony at around 4:30 a.m. The balcony sits at roughly 27,600 feet, and it's one of the last real rest points before the final push to the summit. The replacement Sherpa flagged Luan's oxygen to Weldon again. Weldon pushed them forward. Going through this part was genuinely difficult because you can see exactly where it could have changed. The climb between the balcony and the south summit covers roughly 1,100 feet of steep snow and exposed rock, and it is where the altitude starts making itself impossible to ignore. Luan was visibly slower through that section. The replacement Sherpa stayed close to her, monitoring her movement and her pace, while Weldon pushed ahead in short bursts and waited, impatient, seemingly unwilling to register what was happening just behind him on the rope. They cleared the south summit as the sky started to get light. The south summit sits at around 28,700 feet, and it's one of the last points on the route where a turnaround is still a manageable decision. The terrain between the south summit and the true summit is exposed, narrow in section, completely unforgiving. The Sherpa made his recommendation there. He laid out everything: the late start, the weather, Luan's oxygen, the tightening window. He was clear about it. Weldon kept moving. Luan followed. They reached the Hillary Step and then the summit at 10:58 a.m. In 2016, the Hillary Step was still a defined rock ice feature requiring careful climbing, before rockfall in subsequent years altered its profile significantly. It sits just below the summit ridge, and it is one of the most demanding technical sections of the South Col route. Getting two people through it, with compromised oxygen and a less experienced guide in worsening conditions, is not a small thing. But they made it. I don't think Weldon was a bad person. I think he was a man who had built his entire identity around not stopping, around pushing through, around doing things his way and having it work out. Standing at the top of the world at 10:58 a.m. with a ring in his pocket, it probably felt like it was working out again. He proposed. Luan said yes. A photo was taken, time-stamped, clear sky, both of them at 29,032 feet, looking like the whole thing had gone exactly as planned. They spent around 22 minutes at the summit. The Sherpa stayed close, watching the sky and watching the wind building on the ridgeline to the west. It was the last photo recovered from their camera where both of them were upright and coherent. At 11:20 a.m., the weather moved in ahead of the updated forecast. Wind speeds picked up fast, and other climbers on the mountain that day said the gusts were strong enough to knock your footing on open sections. Visibility started collapsing within minutes of them beginning their descent. What that part of the ridge looks like in those conditions is the whole context for what comes next. Between the summit and the south summit, you are on a narrow, exposed spine of rock ice with serious drop-offs on both sides. In clear weather with working oxygen, it is a climb that can be managed. In a whiteout with wind strong enough to throw your footing and oxygen running low, it is a completely different place. The fixed ropes are the only reliable reference point you have, and losing them in those conditions means navigating one of the most dangerous ridgelines on Earth with a brain that is already not operating at full capacity. Somewhere between the summit and the south summit, Luan's regulator stopped being intermittent and became a near-complete failure. The fitting gave out, and her oxygen flow dropped to almost nothing. At 28,500 feet, that does not give you time to figure things out. Within minutes, her ability to process what was happening around her was gone, and her coordination went with it. She was not unconscious at that point, but she was no longer capable of moving with any direction or purpose. The Sherpa stayed with her and tried to work on the regulator fitting with what he had available. There was nothing he could do at that altitude without proper tools. He also could not physically move her alone on that terrain in those conditions. He stayed as long as he could, keeping her stable and maintaining her position on the rope while the weather worsened around them. I think about this moment a lot when I go back through this case. This was a man who had been dismissed, argued with, and overruled at every turn for weeks, and he still stayed with her as long as staying was survivable. That says something. Weldon was ahead of them on the descent, and the hypoxia was doing what it does, working quietly from the inside and making wrong feel right. His oxygen supply had run lower than planned because of the extended time at the summit, and the deficit was catching up with him. The GPS device recovered from his gear later showed his descent track following the correct line until approximately 400 feet below the south summit. At that point, he left the fixed rope line and moved across the ridge in a direction with no safe way out. Whether he unclipped thinking he knew a better route or lost the rope in the whiteout and kept going without realizing it, nobody knows for certain. What the GPS showed was that he moved a significant distance off the correct line before the track stopped updating. The fixed ropes on that route exist precisely because in low visibility and high wind at 28,000 feet, a person cannot reliably navigate by instinct or memory alone. Weldon fell somewhere on that traverse. The southeast ridge at that section drops off with nothing to stop a fall. His body was found the following day below the point where his GPS track ended. Consistent with an uncontrolled fall, back on the ridge, Luan was still where she had stopped. The Sherpa stayed with her until staying any longer meant he was not going to make it down either. That is the point in this story that I find hardest to sit with. Not because of any dramatic final moment, but because of how quiet it must have been. He made the only decision available to him and began his descent alone in deteriorating visibility, moving carefully and conserving his remaining oxygen, navigating a route he knew well enough to survive without visual reference points. The same experience and knowledge that had been dismissed and argued with for weeks was the only reason he made it back. He reached Camp 4 in a state of severe exhaustion with early frostbite on 2 fingers. When the rescue assessment was made at Camp 4, conditions above the South Col were deteriorating, fast enough that any movement on the upper mountain was impossible for the rest of that day. By the time weather cleared enough for teams to move above Camp 4 the following morning, both Weldon and Luan had been exposed through the night at extreme altitude and extreme cold. There was no rescue anymore. Weldon's body was found on May 15th by climbers from a separate expedition making their own descent. His position on the lower southeast ridge was consistent with a fall originating from the area where his GPS track had left the fixed rope line. Luan was found the same day. The surviving Sherpa guided a small team back up toward the south summit area, and she was exactly where he had left her, still clipped to the rope, still seated, undisturbed by anything except the wind that had been moving across that ridge all night. Neither body was brought down. Recovery from that altitude is logistically near impossible, and both families were informed that the mountain would be their resting place. The evidence recovered from lower camps told a complete story. Weldon's GPS showed exactly where he left the descent line. The camera had the summit photos, the last one time-stamped at 10:58 a.m. Luan's oxygen equipment showed the regulator fitting had failed, the same fault that had been flagged at Camp 3 and dismissed twice. The Sherpa team's accounts documented every warning given throughout the expedition, every time they were ignored, and every decision that couldn't be walked back. The case was ruled death by misadventure. The listed causes were the failed oxygen equipment, Weldon leaving the marked route while hypoxic, the late start, and repeated refusal to follow guide recommendations. The engagement ring he'd carried to the top of the world was never found.